Hello and welcome to the E14 Gamecast, Emotionally 14's gaming podcast. So this is a bit of a different episode to what you're used to, mainly because it's just me. So we had some issues getting a recording together in the most recent occasion. So what I'm going to do is just talk for however long I can about a couple of games I've been playing recently that I've really enjoyed. It's going to be a shorter episode than usual, obviously, because it's just one person's opinions rather than, people back and forth off each other, but hopefully it will fill the gap to an adequate degree and normal service can resume in a couple of weeks' time. So let's jump into it. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Mafia 3. So you'd have heard me mention Mafia 3 in a couple of gamecasts recently, mainly because it is a long game. So I did, for full disclosure, I played on the Xbox One. I went through the entire story. Every single person you had to eliminate, I eliminated, and every single collectible I went driving around to find, expecting an achievement. Nothing that I noticed appeared, so I'm not really sure how to feel about that, besides a touch on the miffed side. So, Mafia 3, for my money, and I did use my money, is the closest thing I've seen in this generation to a Punisher video game. And the reason I say that is because the premise of the game is you were a guy who's been wronged by the mob, chasing down all the mob. And, that's kind of the Punisher in a nutshell. Now, admittedly, without going into too much story detail, the situation is slightly different as Lincoln Clay, the protagonist of Mafia 3, isn't a family man in this case. It's sort of, it's a kind of an extended family that gets taken out. He gets left for dead. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the official, comics canon is what it is, so I don't know what the official accepted Punisher canon is as to how his family, whether he was there when his family got attacked or not. I believe it was the case, but off the top of my head I couldn't tell you for sure. So in terms of gameplay and in terms of raw experience, it's really the closest thing I've seen to a Punisher game on the current generation of consoles. Certainly this current generation, maybe even the generation before. But overall, it's a really good game. So it's a long game, and it does get a little bit repetitive if I can make one recommendation, it's have it on the burner and just kind of dip in and out of it rather than play it through in one contiguous section, because what you'll probably find is it will grind on you. This is something I kind of learned to my cost, and by the time I realised it was kind of doing that, it was too late. There's some really good articles that I wrote a couple of years ago about how to best manage your backlog. Maybe I'll stick those in the show notes in terms of how to juggle games and make sure that they stay as fresh as they can. In fact, I'll definitely put those in the show notes. People might dig reading those. So gameplay-wise, it plays very much like a GTA or previous Mafia games. It's, there's a somewhat of a variety in the story missions in terms of how you approach them. So a lot of it involves, the core mechanic is to draw out a mob boss. You have to take over their district, and the way to take over their district is to knock out their two big associates within that district. So you kind of drive your way around, you sort of go to different places, you blow things up, you kill people, you interrogate people, those are the main ones. And you go through, and once you've done all those things to a satisfactory degree, the boss for that section will open up. You go and take them down, and you can either kill them or recruit them. And then once you've got both in a district, then the district boss will kind of make themselves known. Sometimes, which was really cool, in a kind of hit squad way. So they'll come out and they'll actually come and find you and track you down and start a gunfight in the middle of the street and all that stuff. And those were quite entertaining because they weren't overdone. It didn't happen every single time you took over a racket, which is how they're defined. It happened kind of sparingly. So I think I probably had 3 or 4 retaliation squads over the course of the entire game, and there must have been, let me think, it was about 3 districts per, I ended up distributing about 3 districts per person, and I think each one's got 2, so 6, 18. There should be about 18. So there's certainly between a dozen and 2 dozen people to work your way through, and I probably only saw 3 or 4 retaliation squads, so they're pretty sparing and not kind of done to death. And actually one of the squads is even a little bit tougher for story reasons, which I won't go into. So it's a very pretty game. Mafia 3. One of the things I was really impressed by is I always like it when they render a game cutscene using in-game graphics. So all the video all the stuff that's meant to be videos, all the stuff that's cutscenes is all done using the character models from the real game, and I just quite like that as a concept. I'm not a big fan of the ones where it's so much prettier and shinier in the cutscene than it is in the real game. It brings you out of it. So I like that they took that approach. All the characters look the same as they do in the game, just obviously on a slightly bigger scale because you're focusing on them for sort of narrative purposes rather than the non-narrative purposes. So there's that. It's got an absolutely killer soundtrack. It's got some fantastic sort of 60s music. Rolling Stones is in there. Creedence. Plenty. Too many to name. There's so many. It's a nice mix of rock, and it's got some soul music in there. It's got some, the game is very heavily steeped in the kind of in sort of the race politics of the 60s, the late 60s. So there's a lot of sort of, there's a nice juxtaposition of black music and, sort of soul, and there's a little bit of jazz in there, but not sort of, it's punctuated nicely throughout the soundtrack. There's a good mix. I will say that. It can get a little bit annoying that there are only 2 radio stations at any given time to choose from. So if you don't like either track, which happens occasionally to me, then you're kind of shit out of luck, to be honest. So you just have to kind of hope that when you drive through to the next bit, the radio stations change and it's something a little bit more to your taste. But overall, the soundtrack's really good, so I like that a lot. And the story, I think the story's brilliant. It's a little bit, like I say, it's a little long-winded, a little bit bloated, probably could be a little tighter, but it's a very long game. It's certainly value for money if you can find it cheap enough. And it tells a really good story. It sort of gives you opportunities to be, good or evil in terms of how you approach things. How you do you kind of take full-on retribution and kill absolutely everyone, or do you sort of spare some and kill others? The story does take some of those decisions away from you, because some of them, the characters kind of need to die for the purposes of the story to advance. So, it's a great story overall. It's very, I mentioned earlier that it was very kind of steeped in race politics, and there's a lot of that in there. Obviously, some of the language used is quite uncomfortable, but I can only imagine, obviously, what it's like for the people who had to hear that in those days. It's and a few people still hear it today. So there's still that sort of thing, but it's not. What I would say about it is the race politics stuff is in there. It's very prominent, but it's not ham-fisted. It's not kind of just shoving it in your face and all that stuff. It makes you squirm a bit when you hear like the N-word kind of bandied about. See, I'm not as comfortable as others using that word personally, but obviously each to their own. But it's subtle enough, but it's not too subtle that you would miss it if you're not paying attention, because it is in there. All this, obviously it would be ridiculous not to include it given the time period and all that stuff. And the main character's a black guy who came back from service in Vietnam, so he's there's a lot of that sort of themes touched on in the story. But overall, I would say if you're looking for a game that will keep you busy for a while and provides enjoyable gameplay, Mafia 3 is definitely worth a play. So I would recommend it. You can buy it on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. And in fact, if you go to emotionally14.com, and there'll be a podcast post that plugs this, and at the bottom I'll make sure there are links so you can go and buy Mafia 3 if you want to from the Amazon store, and we'll get a little bit of love from that, and it doesn't cost you any extra. So I'll put it in there. It's up to people if they want to use it or not. I'm not going to hold it against them either way. So moving on. I'm going to touch briefly on the Battlefront 2 campaign. So I played a little bit of the Battlefront 2 campaign as part of EA Access's 10-hour trial. I think I've still got about 7 or 8 hours left on the trial, but the campaign, as far as it goes, is done, because the way they've done it, which I can understand, is a little bit, I'm a little bit miffed about it, but I can understand why they've done it. What they've done is they've blocked past a certain point, which I think is chapter 3 out of 12 in the story. So you get to do the prologue and the first 2 chapters, and then once you've done that, then it takes you to a screen that says, if you want to buy the game, it gives you a link to do it. Obviously, with EA Access, if you have an Xbox One or Origin Access with a PC, I think you get 10% off. It's certainly the case on the Xbox. I'm not sure about 100% sure on the PC one. I'm not a member of Origin Access, just EA Access. Although I should probably consider it, because EA Access is probably one of the best bits of value for money I have on my Xbox. Just for the sheer volume of games I haven't had to buy and have still been able to enjoy. But the Battlefront 2 campaign, from what I played, is pretty fun. It's a nice blend of first or third person shooting with some space combat mixed in. The space combat's a little bit... I don't know if it was just me being a bit crap. Certainly in the game there were moments like that. Although I do think that the game is kind of glitchy in some respects. For instance, I can do this without spoilers. I think it's a little bit pointless to include a power that scans a local area for enemies and tags them if you're then going to just spawn some in that don't get tagged. That seems to me like a daft use of a power. That's just me. Mileage may vary. But, it's got some general foibles and some weird eccentricities, but generally the combat's pretty fun. Like I say, the space combat, there are a few moments where I felt like I shouldn't have crashed, and I did anyway, because the controls did something I wasn't expecting them to do. But I don't know whether that's just because they've changed the controls or whether I was doing something slightly wrong. So I can't really place any blame anywhere, even though obviously on the internet it's popular to place the blame somewhere, usually on the developers. I'm not going to do that in this case. Enough of the blame going around at the moment in the world, so everybody's blaming somebody for something. So, it seems pointless to stick my neck in on that one. So without knowing whether or not that's normal, I can't say for sure whether my experience is just me being a pillock. Smart money is on yes. But what I played was really good. I look forward to using the rest of my trial to probably play some multiplayer, because that's all I've got left. But overall, it was a fun game. Fun experience. Like I say, probably I could have breezed through it if I was really good at the game. I'm not. And plus, there's a few moments where, like I said, the enemies spawn in places you wouldn't expect. So you're in cover. You got a decent bead on the people ahead of you, and then somebody just spawns in from the side for no apparent reason whatsoever, and suddenly you're having to fight off extra enemies that you hadn't really strategized for. It's not the end of the world, and obviously next time you're a bit more cogent of it, so you can plan accordingly. But in the meantime, it's incredibly irritating. So that's the Battlefront 2 campaign. I'm also currently in the process of playing a game called the Turing Test. So this was made available on Xbox One as part of Games with Gold in, I think, October, maybe September as well, but I think it's October. And so far, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a sort of Portal-style puzzle game, and I'm really, really digging it. The story is intriguing enough to keep me going. There's a huge volume of puzzles to do. I think there are 70. I'm about 55 through, so I've done a large volume of the game, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I'd heartily recommend people give that the Turing Test a go if they're ever so inclined. I believe it's available on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. There'll probably be a Switch version eventually, because most things seem to be coming to Switch. I was especially impressed that Doom made it into Switch, considering how technically demanding that game is. I read a piece about it on Eurogamer today that suggested that it's an incredible technical achievement, which I can totally believe, but that it suffers a little bit when things get a bit action-packed, which again, I can totally believe. Anyway, so the bulk of my time is going to be spent talking about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, because that game, having finished it yesterday, at the time of recording, so I finished it on November the 11th, is an absolute goddamn masterpiece. It is one of the finest games in general. Forget Zelda, even just drilling down into that. It's a great Zelda game. It's probably one of my favourite games in a long time in terms of core, enjoyable game experience. Absolutely superb. So I'm going to talk a little bit around that. So one thing I noticed about it is it's a beautiful game. So it's not just a graphics thing in terms of horsepower, in terms of raw processing. There are horses in the game, and there are powers in the game, but never the twixt shall meet in a way that detracts from the experience. I'm not going to be one of those people who decries a game just because it doesn't have the PS4 levels of detail, just because that's kind of dumb. But again, each to their own. I reserve the right to call it dumb. So it's a beautiful game. It's got a fantastic art style. Zelda has often kind of in the past gone for this slightly more cartoony look. Obviously, Wind Waker is one of the more famous examples because that went fully cell shaded and ended up being an absolutely superb game, regardless of its graphical style, because it was just a brilliant experience. So much in the same way, Breath of the Wild is an absolutely fantastic experience, an absolutely beautiful experience, and I would heartily recommend it to anybody. So everything about it to me is excellent. There are a few little niggles, and I'll come to those as I talk. I'll kind of run through them. The camera angles are a bit wonky at times. That's quite common in third-person games, especially when you sort of run up against a wall. There isn't really any way to kind of see what's going on, so you get a little bit cramped. It's not the end. It's not a deal breaker because you can get out of it fairly swiftly, but it's still quite annoying. But it's a very minor gripe. So most of these are going to be minor gripes. So, spoiler alert, I've got some minor things to complain about in a game that I otherwise absolutely adore. So the graphics are, as I say, they're a cartoon style, but they work really, really well. The level of detail still looks great when you bring it in from the Switch tablet to the Switch on the TV dock. I haven't played the Wii U version. I've heard good things. So for full disclosure, I played it on the Switch. It's the only game. It was the first game I bought with my Switch. It's the first game I've completed. It's the only game I've played, aside from little things like Minecraft and Overcooked, which I've just dipped in and out of kind of at a leisurely pace because you can. Zelda is the first narrative-driven game for Switch that I have finished completely from start to finish. Didn't quite do everything because there's tons of stuff to do in that game, which is one of the things that I kind of enthuse about as we go along. The world building in Breath of the Wild is nothing short of superb. Everything feels very... Obviously, there's a little bit of stiltedness to it, but everything feels generally very organic. You're kind of walking towards a town and you see somebody coming out of the town who's just been in to trade, and they've got a little pattern that they follow, and then inside the town there's somebody on their way in a different direction, and when you go that way you run into them further along down the road. It all feels very... The world feels much more lived in than previous games. It's a big open world. It's much better. It's good for it. It's not something where the move to open world has hindered a Zelda game, because historically they've always been quite somewhat linear. Certainly things like Ocarina of Time, I think you pretty much were required to do the game in a certain order just for the sake of getting through it correctly. I think there were probably opportunities to do it slightly different order, but my understanding is, having played it a fair few times, because that's another game I really love, that it's one of those games that really requires a sort of linear investment in completing the levels. So Breath of the Wild doesn't have that. I will say the story is good, but it suffers a little bit from not having that approach. So because you can do the story in any order you want, so there's 4 divine beasts, they're called, they're like dungeons, and you have to go and complete those in order to advance the game and make the end game easier for yourself. You can do it without, much in a sort of... I've heard it compared to the Souls games a lot. I've not really played enough of the Souls games to give it a fair comparison, but I do get the sense that you can, if you're a hardcore, difficulty heavy, really love their challenge player, you can probably go straight to end game early on in the game and try your luck. It's just a question of how much of a sucker for punishment you are, because you probably run through all your weapons at that point. But the game, as a result of the ability to do the dungeons in any order, the story isn't quite as coherent, I think, as it would otherwise be if you were forced to follow a linear pattern. So, with that in mind, I will say that I didn't feel like I missed out on any of the story. So I did definitely feel like I got what the story was about and what was going on pretty clearly. So I didn't have any problems there. I didn't, have any issues following the narrative, because the narrative is it's uncomplicated. It's not simple, but it's straightforward. So, the story is pretty similar to very many Zelda games in the past. Ganon is about making things difficult. It's up to you to stop that from happening. The mechanisms by which that's happened and the way it's happened is quite cool. It's all kind of woven nicely into Legends. It fits nicely within the existing Zelda universe, like all the canon stuff. Who puts that together, I don't envy, because it's probably quite tricky by now, given how many games there have been across all platforms. But it's a solid story. Like I say, it loses a little bit of focus for being open world, in a sort of any order story, but it's not the end of the world. It's not a deal breaker, certainly not a game breaker by any stretch of the imagination. So there you go. So the soundtrack's really nice. The music and stuff is cool, and the sound effects are good. I will say that I didn't really get the full soundtrack experience a lot of the time because I would play with the sound off, because I would be, on a train or something. That's one of the nice things about the Switch, is you obviously get to play on a tablet screen and have to worry about the battery's pretty good on the console in general, so you don't have to worry too much about that, which is nice. So the soundtrack's good, but you can you can do without it. There's subtitles in place for all the cutscenes and stuff, so you don't have to worry so much about that stuff. Gameplay wise, I found myself yesterday, I was talking to my fiance about Jen about the Breath of the Wild gameplay, and she was watching me play, and this is the first time, bearing in mind that she'd watched me play for some time, so probably since I first got the Switch and started playing it, because I don't tend to play on the dock very often. I tend to play on handheld, because I can be in any room. I can be in bed, or like I say, on the train or whatever. And she's asking me about all these gameplay functions, and I'm sitting there describing them to her, and as I'm describing them, it just reaffirms how much I love this game. I'm kind of sitting there, she's like, what does that do? I said, well, that's a shrine, so if you kind of follow that radar and it takes you to a thing called a shrine, you complete the challenge inside. It might be a fight, it might be a puzzle, it might be you have to get to a certain place in the room, and if you do that, you get a reward. And she's sort of following along, and like I say, every time I describe a mechanic about the game, I just find myself reaffirming how much I love this game. It's just superb. It's really difficult to find any superlatives for, further than what I've already done, but it's just a masterpiece. It's so well put together. Much like my opinions on the Switch itself, my feeling is that the put together on that is one of the nicest combined packages of any game I've seen in some time. Certainly in an open world sense, it's probably some of the most fun I've had in an open world, probably since Fallout 4. Other open worlds have kind of not quite hooked me as deep or been as enjoyable. So see, similarly, Mafia 3. Enjoyable, but nowhere near as immersive as Zelda. The Guardian stuff, the mechanics in those. So you've seen a Guardian if you've seen a trailer, because it's one of the things that pops up out of the water and Link fires the arrow. They're cool. They're a little bit there. Similarly, the challenge is there if you want to get into it and you want to really kind of make things difficult for yourself. You can really go up against Guardians when you're not prepared and really give yourself a proper challenge. But if I can complete it, most people can, because I'm pretty good at games. I'm not an amazing gamer, so if I can do it, you can too. So don't be discouraged by the fact that people are describing it as Souls-like. It is tricky. There's a lot of a lot of the enemies hit really hard. So that's probably where the challenge comes in. Is if you get the trick is to not get hit, because if you get hit, then you're in trouble. So the main gripe I have about Breath of the Wild is to do with the Switch controls, and it's not to say that they're done badly or anything like that. There's particular moments where you have to use the accelerometer that's built into the right-hand Switch Joy-Con to move a block or move a puzzle around to make a ball go a certain way in a maze, for example. And I don't necessarily think it's the best engineered solution, because it requires, if you don't have the Joy-Cons removed from the console, so undocked from the side, so if you're playing on handheld mode, for example, it's really, really tough to get the Switch to, you have to move the whole console around, and it looks really weird, and you have to put it in a weird position, like where, for instance, you might not even be able to see the screen because it's facing away from you. It's a lot easier in those situations, if you're having trouble, to open out the controls, maybe wait to do that puzzle until you're on a place where you can do the kickstand mode, or dock it and play that puzzle with the Joy-Con separate from the tablet, because what you find is you can move the console. You have to move the console if you're moving things in the handheld mode, whereas if you just have it docked, you just have to move one Joy-Con in a direction, and it's a lot more intuitive, a lot more natural feeling, and you'll solve the puzzle a lot quicker. So that's a recommendation I would make, having played this game through. I'm not sure. I didn't look up to see how many shrines there are, how many hidden items there are. There's a particular hidden type of hidden item you can find. Begins with a K if you've played the game before. And I don't know how many of those there are. I know I found a fair few, but I don't know, how many that is in the grand scheme. But overall, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is one of the finest games I have played in years. It's absolutely beautifully done. It's very immersive. The gameplay's excellent. The graphics are stunning. The soundtrack's nice. The story's cool. Like I said, the open world element doesn't detract enough it's not a game breaker for the main story. It does kind of unfocus it a little bit, but not in any desperately, unfollowable way. So Breath of the Wild would be my recommendation if you're going to get a Switch, and I certainly recommend you should, because it's bloody marvelous. If you're going to get one, Breath of the Wild's a no-brainer. You should definitely get one with Breath of the Wild. Mario Odyssey is probably great. That's on my list after next is Mario Rabbids Kingdom Battle. And then on PlayStation, I'm going to be playing Arkham Knight, because I'm still behind on that. And then on Xbox, I'm finishing off the Turing test, and then I'll decide what I fancy after that. I've got Shadow of War to play. I've got Watch Dogs 2, both sequels to games I enjoyed very much. So yeah, those are my kind of upcoming games. In terms of what's actually being delivered to me, I've got Skyrim pre-ordered for my Switch, because as much as I love Skyrim anyway and have it on different consoles, I love the idea of being able to play Skyrim on the train. Similarly, I'm waiting for the Switch version of WWE 2K18 and may pick that up when it comes out, because who doesn't want to play a 6-man WrestleMania Money in the Bank ladder match on a train to London Victoria, or any other London stations are available. So those are the two that are kind of on my radar. I quite fancy buying Hidden Agenda. That comes out in a couple of weeks' time at the time of recording, so there's a good chance I'll pick that up. And then beyond that, I'm kind of open to suggestions. So if you have games that you want to recommend to me, then you can always email me at rob@emotionally14.com. You can email the show generally at podcast@emotionally14.com. So I think I've managed to bring this full circle to the point where now I can start plugging stuff. So apologies that this is a one-man show for this particular episode. Normal service will resume. We've got a recording schedule for later on in the month. Hopefully people will be able to attend that one, and we'll be able to get some recordings done and get some more podcasts out to you fine listeners who I appreciate more with every passing day. So the social media plug-in part is usually now. So at this point, it's for me to thank the cast with me, which in this case is myself. So thank you to me. You're welcome, me. If you've enjoyed the E14 Gamecast solo run, let me know, because it would be nice to know that in the event that this happens again, people would be content with hearing me just do a one-off. Obviously, I'm not planning on doing this all the time. That would be the kind of thing that if I ever did crowdfunding, I'd build in as a bonus instead. A short Rob Wade daily or something or a Rob Wade weekly. Just if you wanted to get my thoughts on particular things. So this won't be a regular thing, the solo show. This will purely be just to keep everything running and to make sure people get content that they want to hear about. Obviously, there wouldn't be much point in me doing it every week, because I don't always have a game completed to play to talk about. So, it will be very sparing. It will be whenever nobody's available, and there's a big gap plan coming otherwise. On the downside, obviously, ensemble casts are much more difficult to do with no ensemble, so there will be no Crazy Train next week. It will resume again, like I say, sort of end of November time. Early December, there'll be a new Gamecast, a new Crazy Train coming to follow these. So this will be episode 31, probably just called Player 1 has entered the game. So if you've enjoyed the show, like, share and subscribe. You can find us on iTunes, Libsyn, YouTube, Stitcher, Podbean. There's all sorts of places to find the E14 Gamecast. You can find Emotionally 14 on Twitter at Emotionally 14, and we have a Facebook page, Emotionally 14, where you can interact with everything we post. So we do there's written pieces, videos, podcasts, all sorts of stuff. We work very hard to entertain you fine folks. So I can be found on Twitter and Instagram at RobWadeVision. You can get a sense of what I'm playing there. I usually put up a tweet every now and then about something I'm playing or something that's really annoyed me or made me laugh. There's a few clips on my Xbox account which you can follow at Shade Saber. So that's Shade Saber, S-A-B-E-R, like lightsaber but made of shade. And then I'm on PlayStation with the same name. So if you want to follow me there and see my clips and so on, then by all means do. That's a nice place to do it. I do have a Twitch account, never had a chance to use it, so that's fine. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening to the E14 Gamecast. Player 1 has entered the game, special one-off solo edition. Maybe not one-off, but certainly not regular occurrence. Normal service will hopefully resume in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you for your patience, and bibbidi-bop games.